A key part of any customer experience or customer success effort is data, right? Data is the fuel for everything. We went to different groups, and once we would get them on board with participating with us to build out post-sale journeys, to drive adoption, to drive renewals, we still then needed to get the data. That took 3 years to get access to all the customer data in the company. We wanted access so we could pull it into a data lake, have a holistic view of the customer, and then be able to parse that out into the different journeys that we were creating. And some folks right off the bat said, sure, I understand what you're doing. Here's the data. There were teams that jealously guarded their data and said, nope, this is our data. You can't have it. It's surprising how hardened silos can be within organizations.
Welcome to Customer Unsuccess, the podcast where we cut out the noise and talk with real leaders about their hardest lessons in customer success and other go-to-market motions. I'm your host, Joe DeGrande, and in each episode, we're going to unpack real challenges from real leaders, failed tech implementations, a strategy that didn't yield results, or difficult customers. But more importantly, we're going to take those lessons learned and share them with you so that way you can avoid those same mistakes with your team. So if you're in customer success, sales, or other go-to-market motions, stick around to hear from the best. Now let's dig into it. This week, I'm joined by Andrew Carruthers. He spent 17 years at Cisco Systems, with 14 of those leading their digital customer experience strategy. And in this story, he talks about how he wrestled with data silos, alignment roadblocks, while Cisco was shifting from a hardware model to a software-centric model. So if you're building or scaling digital CX, this one's for you. Let's jump in. All right, let's kick this off. Andrew, thank you so much for coming on the show. I know we had a little bit of technical difficulties, but that's okay. You know, it's never a dull moment working remotely.
Exactly.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for coming on. And for those just joining, I have Andrew Carruthers here. Excuse me, Andrew Carruthers, and he's actually been in the digital CS space or digital CX space for quite some time. He was actually the digital customer experience leader at Cisco Systems. So I know he's got a wealth of knowledge, and I'm really excited to dig into some of the challenges that he had experienced. And but yeah, it's great to have you on, Andrew.
Hey, thanks, Joe. I am really happy to be here. There's some good learnings to share, so I'm looking forward to diving into it.
Awesome, no, for sure. And I think it's interesting when we talk about, and I know we flip back and forth, right, when it comes to digital CS and digital CX. There's a lot of similarities, and if anything, they're also, the names have been used interchangeably as well. And I think ultimately, right, it's the end goal of giving that customer experience, especially when we're talking about digitally, at scale. But what comes of that obviously are the roadblocks, pitfalls, and of course whether it's alignment, data challenges. So I know you mentioned you had some challenges in the past where a project was estimated to be a much shorter, as far as direction, how long it would take, and then it ended up being a bigger project. But I'm curious to tell us more about that story.
Yeah, so I think a couple of things I want to point out that I think are universal. So
Sure.
When we started the customer experience function at Cisco, in fact, we called it Global Customer Success. Later on, it was renamed to Customer Experience. So to your point about the interchangeable nature, I think that is part of what we're seeing today of a sort of lack of clarity amongst people in the industry or the field, as well as, most importantly, key stakeholders in businesses as to what do you do? Like,
Right.
it's like this black box. And honestly, when money was flush and revenue was growing, then I think it was a lot easier to get investment in the function. Now that money is getting tighter over the last couple of years, and I think that's going to increase, now that lack of clarity is starting to cause problems, right? Because people are like, I don't know exactly what you do. So if I need to make cuts, it's going to be for the thing that I don't know what you do. So that's 2025. But when I look back to 16, 17 years ago, when a small group of us, there were 50 of us out of, 50 or 60,000 employees at Cisco that started the customer success or customer experience function at Cisco. And those challenges that we encountered 17 years ago are still relevant for a lot of organizations today, whether they are legacy companies like Cisco, born in the cloud, AI startups. So a lack of alignment was a real problem getting as we tried to get set up at Cisco. The way it was set up at Cisco was like, as I mentioned, this tiny little group. And there was no corporate mandate to everybody in the company of, hey, we're starting this function as Cisco was starting to try to build its recurring revenue business rather than just selling hardware, and getting paid up front and coming back 10 years later to the customer and saying, hey, time to buy, the refresh of that hardware. But rather move to recurring revenue. That's why we started the CX function. So there was no corporate edict from on high to everybody in the company of needing to work with this new function. That meant there was a lack of alignment. So we had to go sell the function to everyone else in the company, all the product managers, all the the renewal specialists for the service contracts, for their management, et cetera. And that took a long time that took years to get everybody aligned with the value of a customer experience function. And it's a little different now. Back then we had to explain what is customer experience. We had to use examples of like Peloton or Ring doorbells or Amazon, right? And so what is experience? What makes a good experience? Why is it important? And all that took a lot of calories that then delayed how we got going. And then a key part of any customer experience or customer success effort is data, right? Data is the fuel for everything. And we went to different groups, and once we would get them on board with participating with us to build out customer experience journeys, right? Post-sale journeys to drive adoption, to drive renewals, to drive upsells and cross-sells for growth. We still then needed to get the data. That took 3 years to get access to all of the data in the company, all the customer data in the company. And to be clear, we didn't want to own that data. We wanted access to it so we could pull it into a data lake, have a holistic view of the customer, and then be able to parse that out into the different efforts that we were doing, the different journeys that we were creating. And some folks right off the bat said, sure, I understand what you're doing. Here's the data, renewals data, telemetry, whatever it might be. There were teams that jealously guarded their data and said, nope, this is our data. You can't have it. And we'd say, this is the company data. This is data about our collective customers. So it's surprising how hardened silos can be within organizations, and getting access to the data was an example of that. So the 3 years to get access to data that we needed to drive things. So that was how we got started. And I think that those lessons, I think that those challenges, lack of data, lack of access to data, lack of cleaning up data, right? And having to do a lot of data work ourselves to improve the quality of the data, lack of alignment within the company as to the value of the function, as to how to create post-sales journeys. How to, one thing, I'll tell you one thing that we did not have a problem with, that I do see some companies struggling with today, some CX functions and CX teams struggling with today, is proving value. Once the function was up and running, the metrics that we used to report back to business leaders were business metrics. So when we talked to the head of renewals globally and the head of renewals in the Americas versus Europe, whatever, we talked about the impact that the customer success function was having on their renewals. We didn't talk about customer satisfaction scores or NPS scores. We explained what they were, but they didn't care about that. They cared about, look, if I'm going to work with you, how are you? I'm going to work with you because you're going to grow my business. I've got metrics to hit. I've got bonuses I'm looking to get. Right. How are you going to help me with my business goals? So that was one area that we stayed focused in on from the beginning. that I think was to our benefit. So we got 1 out of 3 right.
Yeah. No, it's a lot to unpack there, and I think it's
Yeah.
interesting because it's so true. You can't really start unless you have data, and I see it a lot of times with organizations as well. And it's not only at your time there, it's everywhere where one, they don't know where it lives, or two, the larger the organization, it becomes a challenge in order to get the information you need, and obviously you can't get started. But I guess like let's talk about we'll talk about each piece, right? So you have
Yeah.
alignment, right? And I guess like it sounds like in a perfect world you would have wanted probably these departments to be flagged on maybe this project was being worked on, or just like the actual impact of the project. I guess like tell me more about like that piece of it. And I guess like if in a perfect scenario, how would that be circumvented? And maybe that's with
Yeah.
you, maybe you and your team, or maybe even right? Like maybe before you guys got brought into the mix. I'm just curious.
Yeah. So in a perfect scenario, the function was created, as I mentioned, because Cisco was trying to build a recurring revenue business,
Right.
services, as well as moving significantly into software, right? So moving ultimately into a more of a software company than a
Hmm.
hardware company. And so the company made that decision. Stemming from that decision of like a business imperative was, then we're going to need to drive adoption so that we can drive renewals. Adoption was something the company didn't need to care about before, so it hadn't invested in that.
Hmm.
Again, we sold hardware, we got paid up front, we sold to IT departments who had Cisco trained IT professionals, engineers inside. They weren't going to leave to a competitor. The barriers to exit were too high.
Right.
But now move to a software world, or move to a services contract world, where now the barriers to exit are low. So really the customer's in charge. It's incumbent on the company to drive adoption, to then drive renewals. Because if they don't, right, the customers will go somewhere else.
Sure.
So the company recognized that, and then created this initially tiny little function to start building that out. All right, so that's good. In a perfect world, though, the CEO and the C-suite overall would have been aligned that this was a business imperative. This function was a business imperative to meet the business goal of moving to more of a recurring revenue, and specifically software
Mm.
company. As the company's engineers were building software, as the company was rapidly buying different software companies.
Yeah.
So to build this portfolio of software. So in a perfect world, there would have been executive communication to the different leaderships moving down the org chart that this is the company strategy, and customer success is important. So work with this customer success team that we're building, rather than us as this tiny little team having to go convince the heads of renewals or different product lines, etc. Like knock on their door and they're like, I don't even know who you are,
Yeah.
and I don't know why I should care about you, and I'm too busy to give you the time of day. And so that in a perfect world, there would have been executive not only alignment but communication
Sure.
throughout the executive ranks as to the value of this new function that was being created and how it tied to business objectives.
Yeah. No, I think that the business objectives is really what's key. It's interesting too because it goes back to what you said at the end of like the breakdown of how you report it back up. It's not about NPS. It's not about like your customers are you're like satisfied based on whatever the metric is, CSAT, etc. It's really like how it drives the impact. So it kind of works both ways. It's kind of from top down, bottom up,
Yeah.
and then focusing on how the overall impact of what you need impacts the business overall business objectives.
Yeah, because we started to get traction as we went bottom up, as we started to show the business impact, right? So there were some I'll call them early adopters within Cisco who
Sure.
said, "Yep." Mainly, honestly, many of those were people who had recently come from other companies, from other software companies,
Hmm.
recruited into Cisco because of their software background,
Hmm.
who said, "Yeah, we've got to have this function. This is critical. I'm going to work with this team." And so we still, as recently as a year ago, had major product teams in the company
Hmm.
that said, I'm not going to work with you. I'm not going to work with the corporate customer experience function. I've got my own team. Now, this was, I'm not going to call them out by name, but this was a major division in the company that came to Cisco through an acquisition over a dozen years ago. So
Wow.
this is not, they're not new into the company. And when we said, great, show us what you're doing with your digital journeys, we'd love to learn from you. And they opened up the kimono, and there was a set of 3 emails that were triggered post sale based on number of days from sale.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So day 1, welcome, congratulations, you bought this product. Here's how you get started. I don't know, 10 days later, hey, I hope you're enjoying it. A month later, hope all's great. Here's some tips and tricks for feature adoption. Not based on whether the customer had even used the product before, right? So absolutely nothing. That was their idea of a digital customer experience journey to drive adoption, growth, and retention. Like that, there's some total of it.
Wow.
And if there had been executive alignment from the top to be able to say, we're building out a customer experience function, or, go 17 years later, we have a customer experience function that we have invested a lot of money and a lot of years in developing. This is how the company operates, right? You can't opt in or opt out
Sure.
and try to build your own. Not efficient, not effective. By the way, a lot of those customers are customers of other Cisco products. So now they're getting a disconnected, disparate journey based on which products they own or don't own, and just a mess. A lack of alignment is still a problem.
Yeah, no, that it's frustrating. I get it. Like
Yeah.
it's definitely a challenge, and I'm sure that still happens in organizations to today's date. And I mean, as far as going to like now to the alignment piece of it, I'm sorry, the data piece of it, or
Yeah.
alignment on the data silos. Like, I think, do you feel that it's because, or maybe we tap in this a little bit more, because were more hardware focused originally, and then the transition to software, like again, based on the people that were in the org? I mean, was that some of the pushback, and they just not understanding how a SaaS product works, or, it's just kind of like stuck in old habits?
So I think on the data piece, it was less about not understanding how SaaS products work and more about, because on the legacy products, there's no telemetry built into those, right? So we had to start working over time with the engineers to try to build in, where possible, telemetry. So really, I'm talking about core customer data. What have they bought?
Wow.
What are they using? When's their renewal coming up? What's the contact information for the customer?
Sure.
Core data. That was more about silos and politics, and right. So old habits, to your phrasing of, this is mine. I'm not going to give it up. Right. I have value in this. Data is valuable. I'm going to maximize my value by not giving other people access to it. I think that's that sort of power protection strategy. I don't think it ever works.
Yeah.
I don't think it works when leaders sort of hug all the limelight for themselves rather than putting the spotlight on their team who did the great work. I don't think it works when organizations or silos try to hold on to their own information. I think it ends up coming back to bite them. And indeed
Sure.
it did. As we started to get some success and show our mettle, then we had a leg to stand on when we escalated. And then leaders were able to come back to those data teams and say, what the heck are you doing?
Right.
Well, this is Cisco data. And let me add one other really important component from a Cisco standpoint when it comes to data. The marketing team was great to work with, and still are great to work with, and share information back and forth, share tools, right? So we could be cost effective with each other, et cetera. But the data that they had the data that Cisco has for our customers, and I'm talking again basic stuff: name, email address,
Right.
right? Sort of who are you and how do we contact you as the user?
Sure.
Cisco, because we sell through our partners, our resellers, the resellers have that information. The name that we had and the contact information that we have is usually for the purchasing agent at the company, not the user. So we've got to go with and through our partners to get access to the user contact information. So anyway,
Wow.
that was another element that we had to then build out a process. We had to go to those customers and go to the partners. And at first, there was a little bit of you can't. So we said we're going to go contact customers just about service contract renewals. Because we knew we had lower, we were leaving a lot of money on the table with low renewal rates. And they said, yeah, love that you're going to try to do that. And we said, yep, we're going to start notifying customers 6 months in advance, 3 months in advance, et cetera. And they said, whoa, those are our customers, not your customers. You can't do that. And we said, well, you're not doing it, so we're going to do it, right? So,
Right.
But very quickly, we had a meeting of the mind and said, is there a way that we can do this together and leverage the reputation of the manufacturer, Cisco, with the reseller? And so we built out a program to share data. We had terms and conditions around it so that the partners were comfortable that we were not going to take their crown jewel data and share it with, Cisco sales and risk sort of channel conflict. But we could leverage that data. They could leverage the power of the manufacturer, and jointly we would go and communicate, originally only through email, but we added other channels later. So we built a really great channel program because there was an understanding on the partner side of, I see what you're doing. I see how that's going to grow revenue. Like, I'm in. So that was great.
Nice.
Because I think the partners are more focused in on the revenue, right? You're going to grow business.
Yes.
Versus maybe the product managers who are a little less focused in on that.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. It's an interesting challenge because there are, even now, aside from Cisco, there's other organizations where they do have professional services teams, and they're still trying to figure out what's the best way to partner with each other. And I've seen some organizations, they'll create a separate CRM instance where also that brings its own set of challenges, where now that's a separate silo within itself. And then how do you tie it and bring it all together? It does open up a bigger challenge, but that's awesome, though, that you were able to kind of figure out a way to kind of marry it, also make sure that all parties are happy too, because I get it. From a reseller standpoint or partnership standpoint, they want to keep their own data so that way they could service their clients, but also identifying that missed opportunity for the renewals. That's a huge one. Yeah. No, it's definitely.
Yeah. And you brought up a great point. The idea, and it reminds me of a mistake that we made, of creating a separate CRM system with a separate data hierarchy. Yeah. We did that at Cisco. Big mistake, right? There may have been some early gains because it allowed us control to set things up the way we wanted them set up. But what that also did, it created a silo within Cisco. Right. And starting with data, and then everything kind of grew from that. And CX, to be successful, needs to be the glue across a company, collaborating and sort of breaking silos and tying together different parts of the company so that the customer has a connected, consistent experience. Right? That's a good experience. Silos get in the way of that. When we set up a separate data structure in a separate CRM system, we created a silo, and then we had to go back and break that down.
Wow. No, that's awesome. I'm actually curious now too, because from that standpoint, was that just for the SaaS solutions, or was that also from the actual physical contracts as well, like the hardware? And was that like married within the same data set?
Yeah. So that was really for everything.
Everything. Yeah. So everything.
So it was, we added this complexity by creating this separate data set, and then we had to pull data in, we had to manipulate data, and then drive it into our separate CRM system to then parse it out to the CSMs or whoever it might be within the CX function. And as the CX function grew and grew and grew from 50 people to ultimately thousands of people, then we had this behemoth that was a separate entity, and the data we were pulling in, say the renewal contract information, there were other teams that were managing that data. So we would take that data, we would manipulate it to then work within our hierarchy. lots of added complexity that was unnecessary, because then
Wow.
we needed to reverse engineer it to be able to share it back to those business leaders in terms of in data that they could trust and believe in, right? So
Sure.
there was lots of two-way, complication going on. And once we moved away from that, it took years of, once we realized, oh, this is a problem. Then it still took several years to sort of, unwind that decision. So if people are getting started now, don't do that. you drive toward company metrics, business metrics,
Sure.
and use company data and use company systems and tools, because doing otherwise adds expense overall and adds complication. And when you bring in complication, you bring in failure points, and now you got problems.
Yeah. No, I agree with you 100%. And it's, when it comes to complexity, this is something that I tell with my clients and just my audience in general is starting small. And I'm very curious what your starting small piece was in the past when you were dealing with the politics and the data silos. Like you had mentioned, you built that case and say, okay, then it went back to the team and said, hey, what are you guys doing? Why aren't you providing that data? I guess, like, what were those quick wins? Because sometimes I believe it's like simple as dates, right? For like contract renewals or when they start and so on. Like, what was your kind of quick win in that particular scenario to kind of prove that business case internally?
Yeah. So um, I'm gonna phrase this as a fortunate situation as opposed to an unfortunate situation. You can look at it either way. Our service contract renewal rates were noticeably low, like embarrassingly low, and had been for years. And everybody, people ran around in the company, and marketers, product managers, and tried to figure out, why is this the case? Do we need to change the pricing? Should we lower the pricing? Should we raise the pricing, which might lower volume but increase overall revenue? Is our messaging wrong? Is the product wrong? Right? Should we have different values within the service contracts, et cetera? We went and talked to the customers and said, okay, you tell us, why are you not renewing? And over time and time again, they said, oh, I had a contract to renew? I didn't know that. Of course they would have renewed. Right? What? so so unfortunately, that was the situation. Fortunately, from our perspective, and that had been going on for years, as it turns out.
Wow.
Fortunately, from our perspective, the win that we got from addressing that situation was quick and was material and was financial.
And
so by simply notifying customers in advance, you have a renewal coming up, and then reminding them of that several times, and then reminding them after it has expired. I think ultimately we ended up landing on 6 months prior to renewal, all the way to 6 months after renewal, after the renewal date.
Sure.
And it was not, I got to be clear, it was pretty kludgy of an experience from the get-go. Like, we would send an email and say, you've got a renewal coming up, contact your partner. And that was it, right?
Wow.
So now, later on, we were able to build out a much smoother e-commerce approach and customize it, and great. But just simply saying, you've got a renewal coming up, and here are the serial numbers on 3 to 5 of those, so that they knew, okay, this isn't spam.
Right.
These are my contract numbers. Yep, I got it. Okay. But something that basic drove significant revenue and increased renewal rate significantly. So this is something we should have been doing for 10 years prior. But once we started doing it and got those business results, then that opened up a lot of eyes internally. Like, oh, okay, look at those results they're getting. Maybe I can get some of those results too, because my renewal rates are low.
Right. No, it's shocking, but at the same time not shocking, because there are a lot of other companies that are like it. I've been at organizations myself, I won't even name names, and where they just, again, they had a 62% net revenue retention rate. And I was like, all right, let me look into this. And they had no strategy for reaching out to existing customers or focus on acquisition. I'm like, this is insane.
Yep.
It's crazy. Yeah. So
it is crazy. It is crazy. It is crazy. And I think one area that I see a lot today that I think is a mistake that companies are making. I think it's a mistake that CX leaders are making within companies by not being able to influence CEOs and CFOs, COOs. And I think it's a mistake that the C-suite is making, and that is not viewing CX as a growth engine, right? Not viewing existing customers as a growth engine, as a way to protect against recession, tariffs, etc., but rather, something I need to have, something I can complain about if my renewal rate's not high enough. But as opposed to, I've got a set of customers. I want to acquire new customers, of course, but the cost of acquiring new customers is significantly greater than the cost of maintaining my existing customers and growing the wallet share with my existing customers. And thinking about CX from that business level, right? So CX leaders need to be talking that language to the C-suite that's going to invest in them or not invest in them, and then be able to build the journeys that are going to drive that growth, and then being able to track that and report it back. That is CX as a business function supporting the business, as opposed to a nice to have, or as opposed to an operational necessity, right? But rather, this is a growth engine. I'm looking for growth engines. And then that conversation internally goes from, we talked at the beginning of our conversation around sort of lack of clarity around what is CX. Is it CX? Is it CS? Like, I don't really know.
Yeah.
Then you clarify, here's what CX is. It is your business growth engine. And then we can talk about operationally, how do we do CX, right? Well, we build journeys, we've got, tech stacks, all that sort of how. But when we lead with the how as opposed to the why, when we're talking to business executives, we're not clarifying and messaging the value.
Yeah, 100%. And I think what's interesting too, as far as going back, like just in general, the fact that it's still not viewed. Obviously, some organizations do, but most don't. It's still a challenge, but not viewed as a growth engine. It's they forget that when you could find essentially these new customers within an existing organization, there just might be in a different region. They might be in a different function. They might be whatever that might be. It might be a subsidiary within that. And the fact that you just have that foot in the door is all that matters. And it's already warm, or warmer than a typical warm lead from on a more like new business acquisition side. And I think a lot of companies forget that. And that doesn't require the same amount of capital and investment as opposed to the new business side in order, to get talking with that customer, let alone begin, start a sales cycle. But yeah.
Yep. I mean, you've got to build out the functional capability. And when you've got that capability, look for places to apply it that's going to drive growth. So I'll give you a great example. And this was, I understand, I'm not going to call this a mistake that Cisco made, but we had essentially I'll call it a business rule in place that it's a global company, operates in over 150 countries, many, many languages. So just to put some parameters around that, we had a policy that we would translate materials, go to market materials, customer education. We would translate into 16 languages. 16 core languages. Well, that decision was made years ago, and that was expensive. And so a lot of money was spent, and months would go by from the launch of the English language materials to the Spanish or the German or whatever language it might be. And with the advent of Gen AI, we were able, this is why I'm not going to call it a mistake. I understand why Cisco did that, right? If we went to 50 languages, the amount of time and money spent would have been prohibitive.
Sure.
But with Gen AI, and the ability to translate much more rapidly, we applied the CX infrastructure that we'd built, looking for ways to grow revenue. We said, okay, we've got $1 million of annual recurring revenue from Middle Eastern customers. And we are sending them material in English because we don't translate to Arabic. It was not one of the 16 languages. Now, perhaps when the 16 languages were determined years ago, we didn't have many Arabic customers. I'm not exactly sure why Arabic wasn't one of the languages, but it wasn't.
Sure.
So we said, look, now we've got a burgeoning Middle Eastern customer base with $1 million of ARR in simply contract renewals.
Wow.
So service contract renewals. So let's use Gen AI to translate to Arabic and reach out to these customers. And that then turned around and drove a massive increase in contract renewals.
Wow.
And in the revenue that comes from that, and gave us an opportunity through those renewal conversations, those digital renewal conversations, to then upsell. So there was growth in that as well. And that came from saying, where, first of all, doing the analysis to say, where is our renewal rate lower than we want it to be, or lower than other areas? Is it by product? Is it by region? Is it by language? Like whatever it might be. And then figuring out how do we then personalize what we're doing to our customers to then drive relevance so that they then start responding. So not necessarily a mistake, because I understand why that business rule was probably put in place, but it would have been a mistake had we not gone back and reviewed the way things are and how to improve them, right? So optimization is important. Not optimizing unsuccessful CX.
Yeah, no, 100% on the same page there. Yeah, you always need to keep identifying opportunities, optimizing what you currently have in place. You can't sit stagnant because it's just, and it's twofold, right? It goes back to the business impact, but also the customer experience. No pun intended, but it's true. It's all ties back to the customer. Customer isn't happy, or they're not getting, I want to say happy. It's more getting that value and perceiving that value. That's what's kind of key. We could fall in that trap too, where it's not just about satisfaction. It's making sure it impacts their business and their day to day.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm not a huge fan of trying to figure out how do we surprise and delight our customers.
Of course. Yeah.
I think customers want a consistently good experience. Good being defined as gets me to the value I bought this product for quickly and easily.
Yeah.
Like, don't make it hard for me to do business with you, because I'll go somewhere else. You're creating frustration.
Yep.
You can't do the diving catch by surprising and delighting me every once in a while, right? So people talk about, hey, let's empower frontline employees so that they can offer a discount if there's a frustrated customer. Like, yes, and let's make sure that customer was never frustrated in the first place. Right?
That is true. That is true. Oh my gosh. Yeah, you definitely. You if they're frustrated in the first place, it's surprising that they're a customer.
Right. Because we're in the age of the customer where they can shift, and all the data from Gartner and Forrester, like pick your analyst firm, let alone probably every company's own data shows not only can customers leave, they will. And for most cases, or at least one of the top 3 factors, the reason why they leave is because of the experience. It's not, the product doesn't do what I thought it was going to do, because they did enough research to know what the functionality is. They did enough research to know what the quality is going to be. So, right, because that information is readily available on Reddit and communities and elsewhere. So the experience is oftentimes what drives people away from a company to another competitor. And one other thing that I think is so important to today's economic conditions is customers, especially in the B2B world, right? Customers are looking to consolidate their tech stacks, make it easier and more efficient for them to operate, reduce the number of contracts they manage. Oftentimes this is driven out of the CFO's office.
Sure.
The CFO and the CFO office, they're not the users of the different products. But when they look around and say, wait a second, we've got 4 different or 5 different project management tools that we're using, or pick your tool. I'll pick on project manager for a moment. Which one are we going to cut? And oftentimes it's, well, which one is costing us the most per license? All right. Or they're looking for some business metric. Or the other great reason why it's cut is cut the one or the two or three that are least used internally.
True.
And if you haven't driven adoption of your tool, you could be on the chopping block from just simply a cost reduction exercise led by the CFO office. So you've got to drive adoption so that you don't get churned out through through no reason, right? Just it's not due to your product strength, it's not due to anything. You just didn't drive adoption.
Yeah, it's actually interesting. It's kind of a good. We kind of went full circle, and I know we're coming up on time, but like as far as like the takeaway here, right, is it's really driving value and understanding business impact on all fronts, right? Like if we're talking about the CFO, what is your impact to the business? How are you impacting that bottom line? Same thing with your customers. Yeah. Same thing going back to, as far as launching the initiative, right, from the beginning to end, how is it going to impact those business objectives and that bottom line?
Yep.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, Andrew, this has been great. I'm curious, like the last final minutes, learnings wise, like I'm curious, like I got some books behind me. I'm a reader when it comes to like, the self-help business books and among others, and then obviously podcasts. And so I'm curious, like, where do you go to learn your stuff? I'm curious. Obviously you've a lot of experience, but I'm just curious as far as other places that you look.
Yeah. So a couple of places I go. First off, there's a book by the Technology Services Industry Association, J.B. Wood and Thomas Law from TSIA. There's a book that they wrote a few years ago called Digital Hesitation. I highly recommend this book to everybody because it lays out the role of digital and the central role of digital in customer experience, why it's important, structurally how to build out the capability, how to drive collaboration internally, et cetera. So it's a business level treatise on digital. And digital hesitation, meaning too many people are hesitating in this regard.
Sure.
I am a big enthusiast of digital customer experience. I think every customer wants a digital first experience. Read this book. If you disagree with me, I think it'll change your mind, as well as get you started on how to do it. In terms of ongoing education, I'm a big believer. I listen to a lot of podcasts. Digital Customer Success podcast is fantastic. CX Passport, another great podcast.
Nice.
So I think you're doing a great service to folks by with your podcast, by giving people the opportunity to talk about mistakes and then how to correct those and lessons learned, as opposed to everybody just talking about what went well. So podcasts, I think, are a great way to stay current. And then look at one other thing I would recommend people do for a variety of reasons is start a daily practice or at least a weekly practice of using AI tools like Perplexity or others to do your own research around the state of CX or digital customer experience or various journey mapping, like whatever you want to learn more about. It will, one, help you educate yourself in areas where you think you might need it, and two, educate yourself about the use of AI, because AI is obviously permeating every job and every aspect of functions. So getting facile and comfortable using AI to perform daily functions, I think, is one of the best ongoing learning exercises that everybody can take advantage of.
That's awesome. Totally agree. Yeah, I think AI, it's still early. I'm excited to see how it transpires in the years. But where can everybody find you, Andrew?
Yeah, please do reach out. The best place to reach me is on LinkedIn. And love it when people connect, start conversations. I've had some great conversations with people who connect with me on LinkedIn, some of them in person. So please do reach out to me on LinkedIn.
Awesome. Well, really enjoy this conversation, Andrew. This has been great. We'll definitely reconnect on more of this. This is awesome, but thanks so much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Could have talked for hours, so appreciate the time.
No, this is awesome. Thanks so much. That's a wrap for today's episode. Thanks so much for listening. If you got some value from this conversation, hit subscribe, leave a rating or review, and share it with someone who's also out there trying to build a better customer success or go-to-market strategy. even if it's messy along the way. And if you want more frameworks, tools, automated playbooks, check out jodastechtouch.com and subscribe to our newsletter. That link is in the description. Thanks so much for being here. Keep building, keep learning, and I'll catch you on the next one. Quick note before we wrap, this podcast is for educational and informational purposes only. The ideas and opinions shared here are of my own or those of my guests, and don't reflect the views of any current or former employers, clients, or partners. We might reference tools, platforms, or companies, but nothing shared here should be taken as fact, endorsement, or criticism. Do your own research and always consult your team or legal counsel when making any business decisions. This content is not legal, financial, or business advice. It's just us sharing what's worked, what hasn't, and how we've learned from both. So thanks again for joining us. We'll see you next time.